The Granny Killer. The Granny Killer, one of Australia's most gripping crime stories. A man described as normal and well-met murdered 6 elderly women on the North Shore of New South Wales. His murderous rampage would span over 12 months in 1989. How could someone who had appeared to live a normal life murder the most vulnerable people in our society? This is the story of the Granny Killer, John Wayne Glover. In November of 1932, in Wolverhampton, England, John Wayne Glover was born. Glover relocated to Melbourne, Australia in 1956. Shortly after immigrating to Australia, Glover was convicted of 2 charges of larceny and 1 count of stealing in New South Wales. In 1962, Glover was convicted of 2 charges of serious assaults. One of these was a charge of causing actual bodily harm on a younger female. Glover forced these victims to the ground unconscious, where he aggressively ripped their clothing. The victim awoke bleeding heavily and her clothes and undergarments were torn apart. Nearby neighbors were alerted due to the screaming of the young woman, called police, and they acted promptly by shortly after arresting Glover. Despite the seriousness of these crimes, Glover was handed a slap on the wrist or receiving a 5-year good behavior bond and ordered to see psychiatric help. In 1965, Glover was caught unlawfully on premises. Police believed Glover was a peeping Tom, and psychiatrists were very concerned regarding his escalating behavior. It was at this time where Glover was sentenced to 3 months behind bars. In this same year, Glover was employed as a wine salesman. For a few years Glover was a good employee, and during this time it seemed he enjoyed this style of life, talking to and associating with upper-class people. In 1967, Glover met his soon-to-be wife, Gay Rolls. Unfortunately, Glover's employed took a turn for the worse, where he was caught stealing wine product and money from work. The following year Glover married Gay Rolls. A week after the wedding, Glover attended local court, where he was put on probation. Glover managed to keep this and past crimes hidden from his now wife, but decided to pack up and move to Sydney as he was getting into too much trouble in Melbourne. In early 1969, Glover and Rolls moved to the Northern Beaches, specifically Mosman, an extremely affluent area with Gay's parents. His father-in-law was quite fond of Glover, however Gay's mother disliked Glover early on in the relationship. Glover lived in the in-laws' house for over 20 years, where he struggled to keep jobs, constantly changing careers, where he ended up as a 4-and-20 pie salesman. During these years it is believed that Glover did not commit any crimes. During this time Glover seemed to live a normal life. He and Gay had 2 daughters. Over time this seemingly perfect marriage started to fall apart, with Glover and Rolls beginning to sleep in separate rooms. In 1986 Glover was diagnosed with breast cancer, as his mother did. This was a massive shock to Glover, as he had felt his mother had inflicted this onto him. This wouldn't be the end of Glover's medical issues. Shortly after recovering from a mastectomy, Glover had ongoing prostate issues, which led to him becoming impotent. At age 55, this was young for a man to be having these sorts of health issues. This gravely affected Glover's feeling of masculinity and psychology. This is where Glover's seemingly crime-free streak would come to an end. It was believed that Glover resented women, particularly those older than him, due to his poor relationship with his mother, his now struggling marriage, and his mother-in-law, who resented him. During his work at 4-and-20, Glover would visit old people's home as part of his job to sell pies. During these trips he would enter the rooms of elderly women and touch them indecently. At least one of these was reported to local police. At Mosman Nursing Home, Gay's mother was residing there due to her declining health. Whilst in attendance, Glover would leave Gay and her mother and walk around the nursing home into random rooms and yet again indecently touch the elderly women. Although Glover was not cited by any nurses or workers, a number of complaints were made to staff, which then approached Glover and ordered him not to return to the nursing home due to his actions. In early 1989, Glover's personal life began to take a turn for the worse. His mother had passed away, and new boss at his work suspected him of fraud and stealing money from the company. This is where John Glover's true colors would begin to surface. January 11th of this year, an 84-year-old woman was walking along a footpath in Mosman. She was approached by Glover, who violently punched her in the face and stole her handbag, which contained approximately $200. Glover then went into the local RSL and spent the money. The woman gave police a description of Glover, however had no luck in apprehending the offender. At the time, police noted this down as a routine theft. 10 days after this attack, Glover's mother-in-law passed away. As she resented John, psychologists believe that this may have taken off some of the family pressure felt by Glover. But this was far from the case. On March 1st, an 82-year-old woman was leaving the Mosman RSL, where she walked a few hundred meters back to her apartment block. Glover followed her into the building, where he waited for her to open her door. Glover then made his attack on the women, where he struck the women several times in the body and head with a hammer, before taking off, taking money from the 82-year-old's purse. Neighbors had thought she may have fallen and had cleaned up the blood surrounding her, which had removed any potential for police to find any forensic evidence. After ambulance arrived on scene, it was clear that the woman did not fall, however was victim to a vicious attack. After surveying, police found there to be no eyewitnesses to the event. Later that evening, the 82-year-old woman died in hospital due to the severity of her injury. After further investigation, it was found that her shoes had been removed and placed beside her body in the apartment foyer. Just 2 months later, an 82-year-old woman had crossed paths with Glover whilst walking through Mosman. Glover then began to follow the woman into her apartment foyer. This was extremely similar to the initial murder just 2 months prior. Glover then threw her to the ground, where he beat her with a hammer. After she fell unconscious, Glover removed her undergarments and strangled her with them. Glover stole $100 from her purse, placed her shoes neatly next to her body, and made his way over to the Mosman RSL. Glover made comment to staff and patrons that he hoped that this was not another incident similar to a few months ago. The examiner of the body noted that a diamond ring was still on the deceased finger, showing that the 82-year-old was most likely not killed for just money. John's behavior continued to escalate. Over the next 6 months, Glover committed minimum of 5 serious offenses, from assaults to molestation of elderly women. In November of 1989, Glover approached a 78-year-old woman, offering to help her with carrying her groceries. The older woman invited him inside for a cup of tea, however Glover declined. Later that day, Glover then approached an 85-year-old woman from behind and struck her in the back of the head with a hammer, and the woman fell due to the strike and hit her head. Glover then rearranged her clothing and took off with her handbag. He stole $300 from her handbag and dumped the bag in a water drain. He then drove to the Mosman RSL. Police then ramped up investigations linking these crimes together. They were dealing with a granny killer. No more than 24 hours after the November 2nd murder, Glover had his next victim in his sights, an 81-year-old woman. Glover traveled to Gardens Retirement Village for his sales job. During his time at the retirement village, he began to speak with an elderly woman who was sitting on a park bench. After some time, the elderly woman began to feel uncomfortable. She attempted to leave, however she was followed by Glover. As she walked towards the building, Glover pushed her over into a concrete walkway next to the building. Glover then slammed her head into the ground numerous times, rendering her unconscious, and then removed her undergarments and used them to strangle the elder woman. There were no witnesses to the event, and he then stole $60 from her purse. Unfortunately, this was not the end of the granny killer's murder spree. November 23rd, Glover parked his car outside the Buena Vista Hotel in Mosman in the late afternoon. Glover spotted a 93-year-old woman walking down the road with her shopping. Glover then returned to his car and retrieved some gloves and a hammer. The 93-year-old woman, who was partially blind and deaf, opened her front door when suddenly Glover put his hand around the woman's mouth before striking her neck and head with a hammer. When the woman fell unconscious, Glover removed her undergarments and used them to strangle her. Glover then took $100 from her purse and searched the house for valuables. When forensic investigators arrived at the scene, they found a number of clues which would prove to be useful in identifying Glover. At the scene, there were bloody footprints amongst other crucial evidence. A neighbor also identified the suspect as a middle-aged man with gray hair. The reward for the person known as the Granny Killer was now listed at $250,000. A few months had now passed and the year of 1990 rolled around. The day of January 11th was a crucial part of the investigation. Glover attended Greenwich Hospital as part of his job. He entered the palliative care facility and he proceeded to inappropriately touch an 82-year-old woman by putting his hand up her hospital gown. The woman cried out for help, when Glover, who attempted to flee, was confronted by a nurse. As he fled to his car, the nurse was able to get a record of the registration plate in the car of which Glover was driving. Hospital staff were able to name and photo identify Glover, as he had worked at the hospital previously. Although this was a massive breakthrough in the investigation, these could not link back to the previous 5 murders ravaging the streets of northern Sydney. Detectives called Glover after he was identified by the hospital staff and requested he head to the police station the following day for an interview. Glover was a no-show to the interview, and when they called the residence and his wife answered the phone. She told police that he was in hospital as he had attempted suicide by overdosing. Police then went to the hospital to speak to Glover, but he declined. Hospital staff handed police a note written by Glover that read, "No more grannies." Essie started it, Essie being Glover's mother-in-law. After Glover had some time to recover from the attempted suicide, he was interviewed by police in relation to the assaults at the nursing home. Glover was put under constant police surveillance. Glover's actions continued to become more erratic after involvement from the police. He would drive around taking wrong turns to make sure he was not being followed, among other behaviors. On March 19, 1990, Glover would kill his 6th and final victim, a 60-year-old woman who was known to Glover. As Glover was under constant surveillance, police watched him enter the woman's residence at 10 a.m. After no signs of Glover at 5 p.m., police became concerned and received clearance to enter the home. During the time of 10 a.m. and 5 p.m., Glover had committed one of his most brutal crimes yet. Once the 60-year-old let him inside the home, he removed a hammer from his pants and hit the woman in the back of the head several times. He then removed her underwear and pulled her clothes over her head, before grabbing a second pair of underwear from her bedroom and strangling her with them. After detectives entered the house, they found the hammer in a pool of blood and the woman wrapped in several blood-soaked towels. As police began to search the remainder of the house, they found Glover lying in a bathtub unconscious. Just 9 days after police discovered Glover in a bathtub, his trial commenced. Glover pleaded not guilty to his crimes on the grounds of diminished responsibility. A psychiatrist said that Glover had built up aggression from his childhood against his mother and his mother-in-law. According to the psychiatrist, Glover was sane at the time of the crimes. The judge stated he is able to choose when to attack and when to stay his hand. He is cunning and able to cover his tracks. It is plain that he has chosen his moments carefully. Although the crimes have been opportunistic, he has not gone in where the risks were overwhelming. The period since January 1989 has been one of intense and serious crime involving extreme violence inflicted on elderly women, accompanied by theft or robbery of their property. On any view, the prisoner has shown himself to be an exceedingly dangerous person, and that view was mirrored by opinions of the psychiatrists who gave evidence at his trial. I have no alternative other than to impose the maximum available sentence, which means that the prisoner will be required to spend the remainder of his natural life in jail. It is inappropriate to express any date as to release on parole. Having regard to those life sentences, this is not a case where the prisoner may ever be released pursuant to order of this court. He is never to be released. In 2005, 15 years in prison, Glover had committed suicide at age 72 in his cell.